morning and welcome back to NPTEL online certification course on Indian poetry in English. You are listening to the lectures by Binod Mishra, and in the previous lecture we talked about one very significant assertive voice that was on Kamla Das. In this lecture we are going to talk about another major voice, that is Adil Jussawalla. Now, my dear friends, you might have realized that till now we have been talking about Indian poets who, many of them being imitators, and then we also found that there were some who were rebels or can be considered to be rebellious voices. Now, here is one voice, Adil Jussawalla, who is actually a man of the third world. And if we have a look at Jussawalla as a poet, you will come to know that even though many people consider Jussawalla to be a diasporic voice, but Jussawalla was out and out an Indian English poet. And the discussion that follows will tell you through some of his poems, some of his interviews, some of the views of the critics, and while learning through the lines of Jussawalla, we will find what a sort of poet Jussawalla was. You might have remembered well while we were discussing Nissim Ezekiel, an Indian English poet in the true sense, also belonged to a different religion, and here we find Jussawalla is also from a different religion, and then he suffered the tedium not only of being an outcast in his own community, but when he went to England, there also he felt another sort of tedium, boredom, ennui, and he faced the cruelties of the modern world, the postmodern world, a post-colonial society, and all these actually became a part of Jussawalla's poetry. But before we go into the depth of Jussawalla's poetic corpus, let us have a look at Jussawalla's early life. Adil Jussawalla, who was actually Adil Jahangir Jussawalla, was born in Mumbai, the present day Mumbai, and the olden days Bombay, in 1940 in a Parsi Zoroastrian community. Jussawalla was actually born and brought up in a multilingual background. So, he knew Gujarati, he also knew Marathi, and English he had to learn. By profession, Jussawalla actually wanted to pursue architecture. That is why after his early education in Mumbai, he moved to England in 1957, and there he continued for so many years, I mean till 1970. He had actually gone there to learn or have a degree in architecture, but actually took a degree in English from the Oxford University. But during his stay in England, he actually faced a violent cultural shock from which he has not been able to come out of, and that actually paved the way to his poetry. So, this cultural shock during 1957 to 70, during his stay in England, that actually time and again prompted him to have a sort of yearning to come back to his own roots, which was Mumbai. And when he returned in 1970s to Mumbai, there actually in the company of G. Patel, Arun Kolatkar and Mehrotra, he was also very instrumental in forming a collective initiative which finally came to be known as Clearing House, and through this Clearing House many poetic volumes came out. He was in a way involved into various journalistic activities, because he was basically an observer who looked at life, in all its manifestations, in all its tinges, in all its color, and that is why one can find different sorts of reactions in his poetry. As a man, Jussawalla is one such, that his Mumbai apartment is considered to be a Noah's archives, where people of different sorts, different professions come, and they also read, recite their poetry and share their poetry. Jussawalla is a very cordial person, and he once upon a time he had started a poetry recitation, and he actually named it Dangerous Animal. Why dangerous animals? Because there were readings by Rimbaud, Ginsberg, and also Baldwin, and that is why he named it Dangerous Animals. And then he also had another, he renewed it, and then he also called it Locations. So he has kept himself very busy even after his return from England, and he was not only a poet, but he was also a prose writer, and he is a critic, he is a reviewer, fine. So since he was born in a multilingual family, multilingual world, where people of different languages were there, so language actually became a sort of obsession for him, and when he went to England, he actually suffered a sort of marginality and a sort of foreignness. It was also that he married a French woman named Veronique, and he also felt at times a sort of disillusionment with life, with surroundings and all. In one of the interviews, he has himself admitted that I cannot get away from the fact that whatever I do, I will be a kind of oppressor, a parasite. Look at the words, choice of his words, a parasite, living off the fat of the land. So even in religion also, since he was actually a Zoroastrian and he was a Parsi, so he was considered a sort of outsider, and the same sort of feeling actually haunted him when he was in England, and this colored his imagination, and his poetry actually became a sort of vestige of all these emotions. Earlier when he started writing poetry, he started writing metrical compositions, which are actually very famous for childish images and all, but then there are several collections, and in the beginning he had only 2 collections. Later on also he had some more collections, and then he also wrote some plays. Some of the plays could not be published. He was also writing a novel, and then he also wrote the narrative for a play named Chakravyuh, which is quite longer but very interesting. Then there is another collection entitled To Say Goodbye, where you can have a look at the sort of temperament that Jussawalla had when he says, that woman stumbling from a Christmas pub in tears. This is actually from Wandering, a poem from one of his collections entitled To Say Goodbye. The title of the poem is Wandering, where he says, it is written in the form of a prose. That woman stumbling from a Christmas pub in tears, her spectacles broken, the girl cringing outside Harrods, that black man wiping tears with fistfuls of snow, are squatters, they enter my body, so long an empty house, they take possession of its floors. So identity was a big issue for Jussawalla. He also looked at these people, those who he calls squatters. He put them, he actually kept himself in their position and looked at the way of the world. The way of the world actually unnerved him, and there are many poems which actually represent Jussawalla's views. Now, having a look at Jussawalla's works, as I told you, the very first work that he wrote was entitled Land's End, which came out in 1962, Land's End. Then Missing Person. It is said that Missing Person is very significant, a voice by Jussawalla, and in Missing Person we will come to know when we read the poems. he actually talks about his own, his own life, how he has been a missing person, why he is not being given that much of space which actually he deserves and desires. Fine. And then trying to say goodbye came out in 2011, and The Right Kind of Dog 2013. He also, as I told you, he also wrote a narrative for the play named Chakravyuha, and then one of his books which was edited, New Writing in India. Here he talks about the miserable condition of Indian poets in English, Indian writers in English, and then there is another collection which is entitled Maps for a Mortal Moon. Now, we will also look at how Jussawalla's Over talks about his own ideologies. So, beginning with Land's End, which came out in the year 1962. So, you can find that though this was written, though this this is actually a description of his experiences in London, but then it is actually influenced by Christian imagery, Rimbaud and T.S. Eliot. In many interviews, Jussawalla has himself admitted that these were the major influences on his poetry. This poem, this Land's End, actually contrasts geographical place in England with Christian belief in God, with Christian beliefs in God, that whatever you have got, you have to live in the circumstances, you have to live a life of contentment and all. So, there are some poems which are very important in this collection. The poems are entitled 17, and then November Day, 31st December 58, then The Moon and the Cloud at Easter, The Suburb and the Dolls. We can take some of the lines to see how in the beginning Jussawalla had a sort of yearning for musicality. Here we take some lines from Land's End, and then later on we can also find that throughout his experience in England, and even when he came, because his mind was completely, not bereft of the bitter experiences of a new world, a post-colonial world. It is said that colonialism had affected him too much, and he found that every now and then and everywhere people were still colonized. They could not come out of that. So, the yearn and the urge for freedom was actually a consistent theme. Now, here he says, here in the cramped pig's-footed county at last, where seas grip, the airs kick and squall, Atlantic breakers boom, the seagulls fall. Downwind to seats of spray, the fast seas race, roil, slump and sour, across the thrusted coastland where brine wings beat. The rooted perk of wids and brine wings bite, raw rock or nerve exposed to their brute power, Land's End on faiths. So, he questioned, it is the end of the land or the faith's end. What must I call this faulted coast? Atlantic breakers pound, wave after wave explodes, hour by hour to undermine my numbed and bulwarked ground. So, he actually questions the banalities of modern life, which is juxtaposed with Christian symbols. Fine. So, he is in a conflict, and then throughout his poem, whether it is Land's End or it is The Missing Person, one can note a sort of despair. Many people have also called Jussawalla's craft as a craft of despair, because there is a prevailing sense of exile, alienation, disenchantment with the modern life. So, what are the characteristics of his poems? You would like to know before we go to have some of the poems in order to formulate our opinion of Adil Jahangir Jussawalla. There is actually an intellectual longing for roots, because Jussawalla, unlike Kamla Das, Jussawalla was actually a qualified person. He had read literature, and that is why he could also feel the problems of the third world. It was not only just to interrogate, but also to find out the solutions. And as a post-colonial person, as a post-colonial poet, he had to answer certain challenges. The challenges, the anxiety for home, and that is why homecoming is a consistent theme of majority of his poems. The tensions of belonging and the temptation of silence. So, it is said that he had been silent, but then his silence was very meaningful. in majority of the poems you can find how his silence flashes, there is actually a beauty which is imbued with a silence, but then the subtlety of the modern man's predicament can also be viewed in the poetic world of Jussawalla. In the new poetry, Jussawalla describes his poetry as trying to show the effects of living in lands I can never live nor love properly to belong to. So, there is a sort of metaphysical anguish. You live in a land or you live in a world which you cannot live, but you have actually to face the perennial problems of the land, because everything in the post-colonial and post-modern world is changing, and a man is actually man feels himself exiled, banished, and there is a sense of rootlessness. He actually uses modernist techniques like collage, because he was an observer, and then montage, fragmentation, and fragmentation is also throughout his poems, and there is a piling of images you will find in his poems when we read the poems. His actually yearning for the past is filled with a vitality or a vital belief and wonder, but modern man's life he considers as full of sterility, and that is why many people say that not only the land's end, but also the missing person has got many vestiges of T.S. Eliot's wasteland. So, we can also remind here the images of the protagonist of the wasteland in Jussawalla's poem. There is of course, but then when we compare land's end and then the missing person, we can find that there is a progression from the land's end to the missing person, and there is a radical social awareness. Jussawalla actually had his sympathies even for the common and the sundry, and the people who were taking actually menial jobs like the waiter. In the poem The Waiter, he talks about their predicament. If we look at the lines, you can find, blacker than wine from the loaded grapes of France, blacker than mud their Tamil minds recall, dark skins serving dishes to the sallow, sweat more night than grapes blood has, all the long summers they abjured for chance of better prospects, change, a son of contrasts. Stick in a language their clients won't allow, must button up their manners with the past. Here is the struggle of a man who is trying for an authentic living, but then his language is not understood. He is actually struggling for a language, the language which others would not understand, the language the people of the other land won't understand. But then he would grow expert on the epicure's stuffed heart, polite of speech, punctilious, guarded, kind, as guardians of good taste. Fine. These waiters know the soiled and cluttered kitchens of the mind, the rancid oils where sweeter dishes start, cooked like a pick-up's verse, the soot black roof. Behind our pasted smiles their darkness grew, to insight in their day they stand aloof. So, a modern man everywhere he is uprooted. Even when he goes for a modest living, he tries to make his life better, but then everywhere he is in struggle, everywhere he is in problem. And then the last lines have a look at, then closing time, they dream of foodless heaven, shrug off their coats like priestly cloaks of pity, day's ministry complete, slip to their sleeping places in the throat of the feasted pink-faced city. Is there a hope? Is there a hope for all these people? And then you can find that how this racism and this colonialism had affected even the common man's mind. Fine. So, there is a sort of alienation and disappointment, and the waiters, even though they serve food, but they actually appear completely distanced from the ones to whom they serve. There is actually a feeling of marginality, as I have been saying. But then, can this really exist forever? Can there be not a sort of solution? we can find in another poem which is entitled Sea Bridge, Bombay. And here you can find that how the poet's own desire, fine, and how the poet's own desire is reflected in the way the people who after partition have witnessed, and then the poem begins with, no, here actually is a sea bridge of Bombay, and then the poet says, partition's people stitched shrouds from a flag. Look at the lines. Partition's people stitched shrouds from a flag, gentlemen siegered Sindh. So there is attack also, those gentlemen who siegered Sindh, and opened people fraying across the cut country reknoted themselves on this island. So talking about this Mumbai island, which is actually a land, but is it a land which belongs to anyone? It is actually a land that is fractured. It is a land which shelters people from different, different parts, people who have actually been divided, people who have actually been distanced from their roots. And then the poet makes his views very clear when in the second stanza he says, surrogate city. Look at actually the phrase, look at actually the metaphor, surrogate city, as if we are reminded of the surrogate mother, fine. So even though it is a land, but this land does not belong to us. Surrogate city of banks, brokering and bays, refugees, harbour and port. So one that you call Mumbai is a city that is actually of a city which has been peopled by people from different corners. Gatherer of ends whose brick beginnings work, loose like a skin, spotting the coast. And then he says, restore us to fire, new refugees. What a sort of life we have got. So let us restore us to fire, wearing blood red wool, fine, in the worst heat, come from Tibet, scanning the sea from the north, dazed holes in their cracked feet. So here there is also a mention of people from the Tibet. And then again the poet says, restore us to fire, still communities tear and reform, and still a bridge cooling our garrulous evening. Even though we don't have a sense of belonging, but this Bombay bridge is cooling us. Investigates nothing. It does not talk of who you are from. It is just like a third world, fine. Ruffles no tempers, uncovers no root. It does not talk of any root, my dear friend, and settles no one adrift of the mainland's histories. So now there is a perennial question, a metaphysical question, a metaphysical anguish of belonging, my dear friend. So when we analyze this poem, as you will find that the poem is actually suffused with a picture of dislocation and relocation. You can read it at your own leisure and pleasure. Bombay appears to be, this island Bombay belongs to no one and it belongs to everyone. So this actually symbolizes the third world where no sense of belonging is there, yet you belong, and the nature is actually not biased. The Bombay bridge is not biased. It actually cools all those who come either from one locality, from one loyalty, from one faith, from one religion, from whatever. And then there is actually a lot of suffering in it, fine. Violence, pain, chaos, all have been reflected in the poem through the poet's way, the way poet says, no, in the first line, partition's people stitched, he uses stitched shrouds from a flag, shrouds from a flag. Look at the sort of penury, look at the sort of poverty, and then look at also the sort of belonging that they have. Even they do not belong, nature does not discriminate, does not distinguish, my dear friend. We can, and from lands, and we can move to a missing person, which is very significant. And a talk on Jussawalla cannot be complete without making a mention of the missing person, which is very important. The missing person symbolizes the man of the third world who does not belong to any place, to any loyalty, to any faith. He is actually an anxious man. He is trying to escape. He is trying to find a home, even in ecstasy. He is trying to find his roots. He is actually trying to have a sort of retreat. And rightly has one critic said about missing person, that poems in the missing person is described by the poet as poems of exile. It is actually a poem of exile. When you are exiled, when you feel like a banished person, a cultural displacement, because Jussawalla himself had felt this cultural shock, and loss. A voice that is both angry and lyrical, a focus on the post-Franz Fanon man, where it says there is nothing, no, at odds with his real and historical selves. So, we can find the missing person, which he actually composed in 1976. The missing person is a long poem and it has got 3 parts. The first part actually talks about the missing person sequence, which talks about the missing person sequence, the points of view, and then this room and that, which is the second one, and the third part is travelling separately. These actually include songs between 1965 and 75. Fine, I am sorry. So, the and this talks about the problems of modern man. Modern man has to face extreme fragmentation. You are not a whole, my dear friend. You are not the whole, rather you are actually in different fragments. That is actually the reality. And hence, in this atmosphere, there is bound to be a yearning, a craving, a desire for going back home. The first part actually comprises 14 selections. And in this, the poet actually tries to show it through a cinematic vision, and it has got autobiographical touches, my dear friend. The second has got 7 poems which has got different points of view about the missing person, sometimes as a wife, sometimes as a professor, sometimes as a slave, sometimes as something, where all of them talk about the problems of identity. Now, is there a change in Jussawalla from 1962 to 1976? Yes, of course, and rightly has been said by Bruce King that Jussawalla's awareness has grown over the years. When in 1970 he came back, you know, he was haunted by the feelings of alienation and dislocation and all, but in India also, what sort of experience did he have? And Bruce King rightly says, while the Land's End lyrics written in England expresses his sense of isolation. So, there is a sense of isolation, but this poem, this missing person, it actually missing person explores his relation to India, how he belongs to India. That is why, you know, we have been saying that even though people may consider him to be a diasporic poet, but he is out and out an Indian English poet. The persona of a middle class Indian intellectual has been created and then viewed as a victim of colonialism and who feels inconsequential and dissatisfied by circumstances, upbringing, and his inability to understand the contradiction between longings and what might be his belonging. So, we can take the very first poem of the second section from the missing person, and if I read the poem, you will understand the poet's trials, tribulations, trepidations, hesitations, and his conflict, the way he says it has been provided in a very cinematic vision. And he says, that speeding train, it is my life, those are my hands, split ends of sabotage, again and again, buttonholes friends, turned strangers, strangers friends. Look at the internal rhyming, no? The poet may write in a very free manner, not musicality now, but there is a sort of internal rhyming. Turned strangers, strangers friends, believe that is me on the screen, because he is providing it in a cinematic vision. Through the stuttering dust, through the burst open door, and then the one line that comes is very significant, which actually tells a lot about him. The running dog runs, but they have put out his eyes. So, how you have been made inconsequential, you have been hankering after, running after, moving for a vocation, but then what? Your eyes have been put out. Once, and you see the conclusive line, once I was whole, I was all, believe, why don't you believe? So, this is actually a fragmented world, and as a person in this world, I have actually been broken, I have been fragmented. But If a man has been fragmented, if a man had been disillusioned, should a man not long for his own home? And then he actually longs for his own home. And one of the more significant poems entitled Approaching Santa Cruz Airport, Mumbai, where he says, this is actually a yearning back, it is actually a trip on which he is returning. And while he is returning, let us look at the lines. Loud benedictions of the silver popes across to themselves above, a union of homes as live as a disease. So the poem actually has a Christian belief that whatever conditions be there, you have to live a contented life. Still, though the earth be stunk and populous, we are told it is not. Our papal put his nose down on cleaner ground, soon to receive its due. The circling heart encircles sees the various ways of dying that are home. So, even if it is actually a land where there are lots of discontentments, but as the Christian belief says that you have to live a contented life, but then the poet says dying is all the country is living for. So if you have to die, it is better to die in your own country, even though in a sort of inconvenience. And a doctor says, we have lost all hope, all pride, I peer below, the poor invisible, show me my place, that in the air with the scavenger words I ride. And then the poet actually takes a dig. Poet proceeds, even though he is talking about the problem, even though he is talking about a sort of predicament, but then he says, what are these thinkers and historians and the politicians and the social thinkers doing? And he takes a dig and says, economists enclosed in history Chinese boxes, citing Chairman Mao, know how a people nourished on decay disintegrate or crash in civil war. Contrarily, the Indian diplomat flying with me is confident the poor will stay just as they are. Birth, pyramids of the future with more birth, our only desert space to leave the green, burgeoning to black, the human pall, the free couples in their chains around the earth. The poet is having an air trip, and from there he looks at the earth, and even though people may look small, people may look diseased, decayed, whatsoever, but then listen to the views of the other co-passenger who says, the confident, he says the poor will stay just as they are. And then the poet says, and here we find the pinnacle of what he wants to say, I take a second look. We turn, grazing the hills and catch a glimpse of the sea. We are now approaching Santa Cruz, a sense of belonging. The mere coming down to the earth from the air trip will actually provide him a sort of satisfaction and satiation that he is home. Feels the guts tighten and all my senses shake, the heart stirring to trouble in its clenched claw, shriveled inside the casing of a cage. The slums sweep up to our wheels and wings, and nothing is free but singing while the benedictions pour out of a closing sky. And this is home, watched by a boy as still as a shut door, holding a mass of breadcrumbs like a stone. So here the poet talks about a post-colonial third world problem, but then he gets a sort of hope, he gets a ray of satisfaction that he is nearing home, and by the time the wheels of the plane will touch, the poet will have the same sort of satisfaction like a small boy who is still as a shut door holding a mass of breadcrumbs like a stone. Now my dear friends, we find that even though Jussawalla's usual strategy in Land's End is to predict a clearly visualized situation and then comment on it, the personal, social or existential significance which are latent in it. But then Jussawalla's poetry, even if it is a poetry of exile and return, but then we can also find his poetry, even though crafted on despair, we can find that even his earlier works which can reflect a sort of ambition for becoming an English poet, but then he is also aware of the contemporary social and political realities, and that is why he talks about, in a way he at times speaks something that we have to come out of it, but even if my country is in problems or whatsoever, my country is my country, the land to which I belong. his poetry is not immediately transparent, because his poetry is opaque, and that is why his poetry has been at times called to be complex. It is oblique, complex, and at times enigmatic. There is a sort of romantic irony, my dear friend, but then it is for a sort of transformation. The language used by Jussawalla may be abrupt and at times stammering, but there is an abundance of disconnectedness, and that is why the language has been so. His poems, to quote the words of an eminent critic, his poems actually move from tragedy to comedy and from silence to chaos. And in this regard, because he becomes aware of, he cannot remain himself distanced, but he has to connect to his roots, and that is why this yearning and this thinking of belonging for his own country actually makes him a true Indian English poet who aims at recovering his faith and returns to his own roots. To sum up, my dear friends, let me take some lines from one of his poems, 9 poems on arrival, where he says, "Upset like water, I dive for my favorite tree." Favorite tree, tree actually means sheltering, which is no longer there, though they have let its root remain. Even though the tree is not there, even though my people may not be there, but its roots are there. Dry clods of earth tighten their tiny faces in an effort to cry, "Back where I was born, back where I was born, I may yet observe my own birth." So, this yearning for his return to the homeland is finally fulfilled through the last poem we discussed, and we can find that all of us, despite all sorts of odds, the idea to return home is not devoid of pleasures and satisfaction, and homecoming has always been a pet theme for many poets, and especially Jussawalla's world also recovers from the sort of what he says he had lost, and he wants to reclaim it, and it seems that he has been able to reclaim it. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much. I wish you all good luck, and I wish you all to trace back your own roots, your own belonging. Thank you very much.